You want to create the ethos at your school where people aren't asking, what if I say something and I'm wrong? But they're asking, what if I don't say something and I'm right?
Diversity is seen as being protective, but actually the research shows that diversity alone is not protective. A diverse environment is not inherently more safe for children who are diverse in different ways. We actually have to do that work and make sure that we are building safety and not just relying on the fact that we have international mindedness as a value in our school.
You're listening to Data Talks, the podcast from Data in Schools, in association with Atlanta International School and the Mona Lisa Effect, and sponsored by Veracross and IntelliSchool.
I'm Paul Swanson, Director of Innovation and Institutional Research at Atlanta International School and part of the Data in Schools team.
And I'm Matthew Savage, Educator, Leader, Consultant and Coach.
Today we are delighted to welcome three safeguarding experts, Priya Mitchell, Debbie Downs, and Layla Holmyard. Priya is a UK qualified social worker and founder of PMC Safeguarding, specializing in child protection, well-being, and safeguarding culture in international schools. She brings over 30 years of experience across education, social care, and global safeguarding consultancy.
With a career spanning social work, teaching, school leadership and child safeguarding, Debbie Downs is the Director of Global School Initiatives at the International Centre for Missing and Exploited Children and the co-chair of the current ITFCP Committee on Online Harm and Abuse. And Layla Holmyard is a safeguarding consultant and trainer with extensive professional experience in safeguarding and child protection, working with organisations and schools globally. She holds a PhD from the University of Bath, through which she explored the landscape of child protection and safeguarding in international school contexts.
So welcome to our podcast, the place where data talks and we listen.
We have something of a powerhouse of expertise in safeguarding child protection, and it's a fascinating opportunity for us to dive into the role of data in doing that better and deeper and more effectively, I guess. And you're all involved in the International Task Force for Child Protection. I wonder if we could just kick off by asking what prompted the task force to develop specific guidance on data collection in a safeguarding context.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, everybody. It's nice to be here. I think one of the biggest drivers of our work was recognizing within our community of kind of consultants and other people working in safeguarding and child protection that we are seeing a big shift right now from paper-based or using other school systems for safeguarding data and record keeping, that schools are looking for something a bit more specialized, and they're moving into looking at software that's dedicated to safeguarding and child protection record keeping. And we were also getting a lot of questions about that. And I think that there's also a lot of complexities around adding new systems into schools and schools asking questions like, can we use the systems we already have for this? And what might be the barriers to that? So we were just getting a lot of questions, and we knew that this was something that we wanted to explore. We started by doing a survey so that we could understand what the landscape is right now. And then together in a group, we developed guidelines and supports. And that's now published on the International Task Force on Child Protection page of the ICMEC website.
And Priya, have you seen those same challenges and questions in the schools in your network, crying out for better ways and more effective ways to collect and store this data?
Yeah, when I was involved in the project, what was really interesting is that there is, sometimes we can make the assumption that all schools are quite far along that journey in terms of data and child protection data. And one of the lessons I took away from being involved in the project was actually schools are at very, very different parts of that journey. One of the things that I'm navigating at the moment is CPOMs coming in across a group of schools. And some people have used it before and are really au fait with it and find it a really easy system to use. I have other people who were taking on the journey of, what is safeguarding? What should be in that safeguarding? Do we really need another system like Layla's just said? We have all of these various systems. I think the interesting thing, one for me, is around allegations against staff and SCRs and how many different systems are in place in terms of that data recording.
And Debbie, what's your take on this?
I'll just say I was very happy when I knew that this committee was working last year and was super happy to join it because I get so many questions about data in international schools, and there aren't, other than Layla's recent PhD thesis, there aren't a lot of great answers out there that are specific to international schools. So I hope that from this will come some better data collection that kind of captures the uniqueness of international schools and safeguarding in our context.
When you talked about Layla's research, and I found it a fascinating read myself, and there's so much there about contextual data. And I wonder if we can then throw this next question to you, Layla, and please share whatever additional perspectives you'd like to. We know that international schools sit at a crossroads of mobility, transience, affluence, etc. How do we ensure that safeguarding data can adapt to those contextual risks rather than pretend they don't exist? Because I know so much of your work in your PhD is around the importance of that context and that contextuality.
Yeah, thank you. First, I just want to speak a little to the affluence of schools before we go into those other factors. And I think one thing we were really mindful of was that not all schools can afford a software system that's just for safeguarding. So I think even though we've gone straight into talking about this shift towards these bespoke systems, we did within the guidance include the full range of options. And there's even guidance around how to use a paper system in a safer way. So how to really think about the security around that data if you are still using paper. How can you use like the Microsoft system, for example, to create an encrypted file structure that will increase safety? But then I think the reason why we're seeing this swing to a lot of these more bespoke systems like CPOMs and My Concern is the fact that you can not only track concerns around the perpetrators of harm that might happen, so students that do harm to another student, which we do in our behavior systems anyway, but we're also tracking students that have been harmed. And sometimes that student is both, and we see that around particularly identity-based harm. You might have a student who has experienced identity-based harm, but has also done identity-based harm to someone else. And that really changes the conversation when you're looking at that data from both perspectives. And most behavior modules don't record that behavior on the other side, like the student that's experienced the harm. So, and then it's looking for patterns in families as well. So if we stick with the idea of like racism, for example, you can have a student that's been victimized multiple times, and systems allow us to then track that and say that even though this one event might be quite small in the grand scheme of things, it's actually part of a big pattern that this child's experienced, but also maybe that siblings have experienced as well. So then you're suddenly looking at the family perspective and saying, oh, well, I'm going to be calling this parent, and they've actually had this conversation before with this school, but with their other child. And then we can then look at then patterns for the whole school. So are we seeing an uptick in certain forms of harm and why that might be? So when we look at our recording systems, we really need to be thinking about how we can look at data from the individual perspective, the family perspective, and then patterns across the whole school. And it's quite challenging to do that with a lot of existing school systems.
Do you want to add to that, Debbie?
Yeah, I was just going to say the other reason I was very happy that this committee was organized and super happy to join it is that it's unfortunate, but we still hear from schools that, oh, those things don't happen here. And that's really disheartening because we've done so much work in this area. And I think the more work we do, the more we realize that it is happening in our schools. So I think if we can gather some data in really organized ways, that will help us to combat the idea that abuse isn't happening in our schools. Our kids aren't having adverse experiences. They're not experiencing identity-based harm, because they are.
And there's an interesting nuance there, Debbie. I was speaking to a head in London just a week or two ago, and they were talking about an intentional move away from saying it could happen here to being more specific and saying it has happened here and it will happen here. Do you sense that shift being helpful in terms of informing how data is collected and used?
It absolutely does. I think that that's a very positive shift in language because it is happening at every single school that I'm aware of. It has happened. It may be currently happening. And I think it is very helpful to be transparent about that, because that helps with the reporting of it, right? It helps when people know this is something that's happening and this is something I can speak up about because other people have spoken up about it and the school is responding to it. The school is aware of things. I think that is a super helpful language shift rather than it could happen here. You're right. That does leave open, like, has it? We don't know. It could. But I think the idea that it has happened here and it may be happening now is a positive shift in the language around this.
Could I jump in as well? One of the things that I think data helps us to do is also to track across an academic year where there may be spikes happening. So, for instance, I delivered some DSR training a couple of weeks ago, and I said, as we come up to the end of term, so we have this unique winter holiday from this academic year here in the UAE, where we now have 4 weeks as a winter holiday, which is a very, very long time. And then the week prior to that is our National Day holiday, where we've got a long weekend. So basically, the kids for the last week of term are in for 2.5 days. So we know there will be some families that actually the 28th of November will be the last day we see those children. And then they have 5 weeks holiday. And if we come at it for some students, school is their safe place. Yeah, that is where they want to be. So that 5 week, whether it's 4 or whether it's 5, it's neither here nor there at that point. It's a long holiday. And what I was saying to the participants is you need to start looking for changes in behavior, because they may be very nuanced. They may be very subtle. But for those students who don't want to go home for that 4 weeks, you'll see those subtle changes. And what I've seen, and I said, I'm expecting a spike in about 2 weeks' time in terms of referrals that are going to come in. And that is exactly what we're seeing is, the referral rate is going up and children are saying, I'm not sure about the holidays. So also looking at that data, as we collect it year on year on year, and when you're then say, as the child protection lead, safeguarding lead, when you're delivering training throughout the year, reminding staff of that this is the data, this is what the data shows, that we have spikes at this time of the year, to kind of remind staff of what are the signs and symptoms they need to be looking at, and so you're kind of trying to connect the dots in a way as to, we're not just talking about these are signs and symptoms. These are the signs and symptoms. This is when you're going to see spikes. So this is where you have to be kind of more aware of it. So maybe doing a little bit of twilight inset before those spikes are likely to happen, and remind our staff so that you're getting, you're able to get in there and hopefully protect the children in a better way.
I love that. And I love when we can use that point about proactivity to loop back to a question I asked earlier of Layla around your wider research, because it seems to me some of the strongest things that came out to me from your dissertation were around proactivity and context. And the better we can understand context and those contextual factors, the better we can be proactive in acting before it's too late. Is that a fair summary? To reduce a dissertation down into 2 sentences doesn't do it justice anyway, but I wonder if you'd like to speak to that contextual data in safeguarding.
I think the contextual factors make a huge impact on safeguarding, that's for sure, and definitely international school safeguarding as well. In my research, I talk about 3 contextual pieces, which is transience, affluence, and diversity, as impacting many international schools. Some in different proportions and in different ways, but those 3 factors tend to impact international schools. And I think we've talked so far about data around concerns about students, but I think there is a breadth to data around safeguarding, which we can think about too. For example, when we think about transience, we can think about admissions. And so how are we bringing students into our school, especially if we have a highly transient student population? What information can we learn, and how can we make it safe for parents to share that information with us during the admissions process? And what we can see in other studies, not my own, but other studies that have been done, is that international schools can have really high stakes admissions process, especially prestigious schools. So parents can be really worried about sharing concerns around mental health or prior trauma during admissions. So adding in like a meeting after admissions just to say, look, we want to welcome you and your family into the school. We know that everybody comes here with different experiences. In order for us to support you and your family, and your child, we need to understand like where you've come from. Is there anything that might be impacting your child? And just by opening those conversations, you might get information around learning support, prior assessments, prior traumatic events, bereavements. These kind of contextual pieces that can really help you understand the child. I just want to cite my wonderful colleague, Dr. Doug Walker, for sharing that with me. And I feel like I roll it out at every opportunity, because I think it is so important that we understand students as early as possible to be able to meet their needs. And then on the flip side of transition, you've then got students leaving your community. And that's where schools really need to look at their data retention and data transfer laws within the context. And I think one thing that we talk about a lot in trainings is around getting the right guidance, because sometimes your generic data protection specialist might not know the nuances of the law around child protection data. So really exploring that within your context so that you are able to then pass on concerns in a way that's legal, but also in the best interests of the child and the family as well, if you need to pass them on. I don't know if Priya or Debbie, you want to add anything in terms of intake and also data transfer as well.
It's interesting you say that, Layla, because that's one of the things that we're navigating at the moment here in the UAE, and they have got a data protection law here. But what is becoming very clear is that we've gone from you can't share anything in terms of safeguarding data across schools to there is an exception. Whilst yes, the law it's about personal effects and personal assets, and defamation here is something that people really don't want to cross those lines. But when it comes to safeguarding, there has been a recognition that is going to be an exception to a rule. And, one of the things that some schools are really good at sharing that safeguarding information across schools. Other schools are like, well, what is this reference? I'm not filling this reference in. And, I had conversation today with my staff, and they were saying the same thing. We don't get that safeguarding information soon enough. And 100%, it's not about us saying to a parent, look, your child will not be allowed into our school. You don't get a seat at our table if there's safeguarding information. It's the flip that we're saying, actually, what it means is we can have that safeguarding plan ready to go for the moment your child walks in the door. So we're being proactive. We come back again to let's be proactive rather than reactive. Let's do safeguarding rather than child protection. And I think, that for me is the biggest shift that needs to be made. Debbie, you were nodding away, so I'm assuming that you have something you might want to add.
No, just to highlight what you both said. I think that all of those pieces are so important, that we know early how we can support a family, and that we don't have to lose sleep when a child leaves our school, because we know that they're going to get the help they need in the next school. So just having those policies and procedures in place to make sure we know as early as possible and that we're able to pass on information, I agree, it's so crucial.
Then, of course, there's the adults and information about adults that we hold within the school as well. Everybody's nodding. Yes. So, and I think I think, first of all, we can talk about just professional development and tracking that, because I think that's part of our safeguarding data set as well, that we have, like, who are our adults within the school and how are we training them and raising awareness around safeguarding, and like which parents are engaging with us in parent workshops. So just kind of how are we reaching our community with the messages we want around safeguarding, because then that kind of becomes part of your safeguarding data set as well. Things like the number of self-reports that you get can be a great indicator that your systems are going well and that you have a high level of trust within your school. And so by self-reports, I mean when people inadvertently or accidentally or due to some kind of event that happens, they cross a boundary that they wouldn't into practice that isn't their normal practice and wouldn't be maybe normal practice within the school, that they come and talk to the safeguarding lead about it, so that it kind of brings it to the school's attention, so that everybody's aware that happened, and then we can then kind of take action if needed. But in many cases, it's just a misstep that needs to be verbalized and recognized as well. And I think that how we store that data about colleagues is something that schools can be very concerned about, especially because of the confidentiality and privacy. And again, thinking about the law and how it overlaps with HR processes. which then links to safer recruitment, of course, as well. So I'll pause there if anyone wants to jump in on safer recruitment.
That was exactly what I was going to talk about as well, because I think we're very, schools are getting good at, okay, you know, this is the teacher, these are the teachers and even teaching assistants that are coming into the school, and here's our single central record, and these are all the bits that we need to pick up on. But there's a bit of a grayer area when we've got external contractors. So, you know, bus drivers, the nannies, the cleaners, you know what I'm saying, or our one-to-ones. So we have a situation in the UAE where parents can employ somebody to be like a shadow teacher, a one-to-one teacher solely for their child. And, you know, where there's kind of a additional needs and there's a need for that. And then there's a whole thing about, okay, but they're not employed by the school, so therefore, who is then accountable for doing those safe recruitment checks? Because they're not employed by the school, but however, they're in the school. So those safer recruitment checks still need to be done. Or if you've got, say, students who've got OT or speech and language coming in, again, they're external providers. Where does the accountability lie for those safer recruitment checks to be done? You may not do the same wealth of secure checks, but, you know, at a basic, you want to kind of have an identity check and a like criminal record check. You want something, and it's about where do those accountability pieces lie. So picking up safer recruitment, we think bog standard, all of the teachers that we've got employed, but there is so many more that need to come under that remit and that data.
Imagine a system that understands how independent schools work, where the soccer coach is also the algebra teacher, where parents are alumni, where everyone plays multiple roles. Most school software forces you to juggle separate systems for students, parents, alumni, donors, fragmenting the people you serve into disconnected data points. It's exhausting, and it misses what matters most. Veracross is different. One person, one record. Comprehensive software that connects every department with real-time data, all centered on the whole person. No silos, just seamless collaboration across your entire school. Veracross.com. Trusted by 3,200 schools worldwide. Imagine what you could achieve with data that works for good.
You all are pointing out there's just a ton of nuance. And like when we think of safeguarding data, it's much, much, much broader than reporting an incident. And I guess my wonder, if you could speak to it, what advice would you give to schools in terms of managing that need to be able to see across lots of different types of systems and data sets and be able to see those connections and patterns in order to actually keep kids safe, but also having concerns about data privacy and making sure that people don't have access to inappropriate information? It seems like there's a tricky balance, at least for some roles.
Yes. Yes, it is a tricky balance. And so generally what we recommend for data involving children is, and actually adult conduct concerns as well, is that there's two people who every now and then check in on the records that are being kept, the reports that are being made, to make sure if there's repeated patterns in there that they're being escalated appropriately. So often we recommend that the designated safeguarding lead and the head of school are the two people who have access to all of the records, can go in there from time to time and just look like, you know, these low-level concerns, these adult conduct concerns, boundary crossings, or maybe it's about a child who, you know, is often dressed inappropriately for school, meaning for the weather for school, or, you know, doesn't always have a lunch to eat, that you're kind of looking and noting when are the patterns and when do we need to escalate this, and that there's two people in charge of that, two people who are not married to each other or otherwise related to each other, but do have the professional roles and capacity to go in there and do that work.
I wonder if we can take it back to something else you mentioned earlier, Layla, and that's the very real kind of spectre of identity-based harm. Often in lots of schools, I see that minimized or I see it mislabeled. And I wonder how could schools better, more effectively, more impactfully collect and interpret data on racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, etc., in ways that actually lead to action and change. I wonder if you or any of the others have thoughts on that.
I can share a little bit of what's been done at Frankfurt International School, which was that when we were looking at identity-based harm, one of the things that was important was to lower the threshold and say that this is something that always needs to be brought to the attention of the safeguarding team. So even what might have previously been addressed at the level of the teacher, for example, when it's identity-based harm, it kind of puts it straight into a safeguarding bucket. And then that should be shared. And that's even if it's not directed at an individual, maybe it might be something that's said in a group setting. We need to be logging those cases. And that's been really useful because it's given us some baseline data to really understand the landscape. So what are the kind of incidents and events that have been happening? And I was even asked to take a look today at a particular form of identity-based harm to say, do we have any sense of whether there's an uptick in this at the moment? And I was able to look at the data and then be able to kind of make a judgment on that, whether the data we had was reflective of how people were feeling. So I would say collecting data is, I mean, it's one part of many actions that can be taken in this area. But I think it goes back to what you said at the beginning around, like, do schools really believe these things happen? And international schools over their history tend to be viewed as very close, safe, tight-knit communities. Diversity is seen as being protective, but actually the research shows that diversity alone is not protective. A diverse environment is not inherently more safe for children who are diverse in different ways. We actually have to do that work and make sure that we are building safety and not just relying on the fact that we have international mindedness as a value in our school. So I think understanding our landscape better is the foundation of the other work that needs to be done around education and intervention.
I wonder, Debbie, can you speak a little bit to the challenges that schools are facing in identifying and acting upon that data around identity-based harm? I think particularly of sociocultural contexts or regions or countries where that becomes much more challenging, and yet those very identities and characteristics are still there, often plentifully within that school. So I wonder if you can speak a little about the challenges that schools face in gathering that identity-based harm data and acting on it, and what creative solutions you're seeing played out.
Okay. Yeah, the problem part is easier to speak to, of course. I mean, I think with some of the political movements in the world at the moment, there certainly is pushback against doing the work that we've been doing to recognize and be proactive in addressing identity-based harm. And then, of course, there are some cultures where certain identities are not recognized or are not legal. And all of that can make it very tricky to address things. And there are forms of identity-based harm that it's interesting country to country, like who the majority of the student body is made up of and what something like racism looks like, depending on who the majority of the student body is. There's so much there that makes it difficult. We get parent pushback when we start talking about identity-based harm. We get students saying, what? Like, I'm joking, like it's fine, it's fine within my friend group. We all understand each other. And then I think culture can be either rightly or wrongfully blamed for some of the identity-based harm that happens in schools. So there's a lot there. I do know that there are some really wonderful folks looking at ways to help schools address identity-based harm proactively, no matter what the political climate is or the culture of the country in which the school's operating. So I have hope that we're figuring out solutions.
I think there's also the whole area of the adults in the building and their understanding of contextual safeguarding and their understanding of cultural nuance, their understanding of identity-based harm So, I'm currently looking at global majority children and the safeguarding needs of global majority children, and how in international schools there is a gap. And it kind of leads on from what Layla and Katie have done in their research. There really is sometimes this blind spot in terms of understanding the children within our schools and what they bring to the table. Whether we're missing it or we don't want to act on it, those cultural nuances then feed into poor classroom behaviour, which then feeds into how a child may then perceive themselves and the narrative they have. And then we're in this vicious circle of children believing something about themselves. They will then behave in a particular way that's perceived in a particular way, and we just go round and round in the circle. We need training, and we need to break that down for our staff. And also, picking up on the diversity issue, one of the things in international schools is they're not diverse. They're really not diverse in terms of the staff retention and the staff that are there. And for a lot of our students, they don't see people who look like them. And that, for me, when we're talking about identity-based harm, is something we need to be looking at. If I'm a child and I see nobody who looks like me, nobody that will become a role model for me, and yet what I see is people who don't look like me, who maybe don't understand when I am potentially in a safeguarding situation where other students maybe are doing something to me about my identity, whatever that identity issue is, we have a problem. And it's a problem that's not going away, and it's a problem that needs tackling. And it's one of those areas that I think we tread round very carefully, because we don't want to upset people, and we don't want to be the person that raises it in a school, because we all need our jobs to be safe. But it is an area that's not changing, and it hasn't changed for a very, very long time, and we need to change it.
I think one of the drivers of change is another data set that we haven't talked about yet, which is the student voice. And I think that with identity-based harm, but other forms of harm as well, like sexual harm, actually hearing from students about the experiences that students in their school are having is really powerful for changing minds and driving investment and having people pay attention to these areas. And so, for example, the Contextual Safeguarding Network has a sexual harm survey that is a model survey that schools can use to really explore the prevalence of sexual harm within schools. The task force a few years ago worked on a protocol for running student focus groups as well around safeguarding, because even though a focus group's quite straightforward, when you're talking about topics that can be so high stakes for students, we really need to think about the ethics and the safeguarding around running those groups. But there's nothing more powerful than sharing student voice with teachers and teaching assistants and other people working in schools for making these kind of challenges that students face clear and real to them.
Yeah, Leila and I, we were thinking on a similar wavelength. I was just thinking about how powerful restorative practices can be in situations, especially with identity-based harm, where restorative practices can help to get to the root cause of something that's going on and help students to be part of the solution for it. And then I think with everything that we do in the safeguarding realm, one of the most powerful tools that we have as adults who spend a lot of time with kids is keeping open channels of communication, letting kids know that we're interested in what's going on in their lives, having little check-ins with them, and not check-ins that feel like check-ins, but, just having little conversations with our students that let them know that we're curious about what's going on in their life, that we like to know what they're interested in. And so that channel is open, so that if there is something going on, they tell us, because the most insidious thing is when there is identity-based harm, and some of Layla's research has highlighted this, that often students know that it's happening and adults have no idea. We think we've done all the proactive stuff, and we haven't. And students are so when you ask students, like Layla said, when we do involve their voice, then you become aware that there are things going on under the surface. And so just having that open channel of communication with kids so that they know they have the opportunity to tell us when they do get to the point that they need help.
Obviously, there are massive differences between data in a safeguarding context and data in other contexts within a school. But also, as we were talking about, Layla, there's that intercontextual dimension that we mustn't ignore. And lots of what we're talking about here is about making sure that we record safeguarding data effectively, which applies to all data in schools, that we store and analyze it effectively, which applies to all data in schools, and that we do something with it that affects positive change, which applies to all data in schools. There's an area, though, that I wonder is a challenge to some schools, which is that with safeguarding data, the school isn't the only party involved. And there is a point in different legislative structures and different sociocultural contexts where an outside agency needs to be engaged. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit to the challenges of maintaining data integrity and privacy in that context when there is a flow of that data into an outside service that perhaps might do things differently from how we feel it should, or perhaps we don't have full confidence in or don't maybe know enough about, seems a little bit shadowy. Yeah, how do we ensure that data remains safe, even though there's a flow out to agencies over which we don't have control?
I can take that one, because having watched the child protection system develop in the UAE, it's fascinating to be part of a developing system. And we've gone from there are no external agencies to we now have external agencies, but they're at the kind of infancy of those external agencies to how they're now beginning to be embedded. And we've moved from no, we won't make any referrals. We'll manage everything in the schools ourselves because we're too worried that the people outside don't know what they're doing. So the people outside saying, well, you tell us that we haven't got enough staff, but we don't get any referrals. So it's like that, both sides are kind of going, something needs to change. And to kind of now where people are getting more and more confident in saying, okay, we need to make those referrals. The law is telling us, we're mandated to report. So therefore, we need to do what the law says. And we make those referrals. And actually what's happening is as more referrals are being made, there are more conversations going backwards and forwards between the schools. And the schools themselves are now getting more confident in having those conversations. Because I think there was a fear maybe that the external agencies don't know what they're doing. They're going to make it worse for the families. The children will be at more risk. And what we're actually seeing is there's quite good conversations going on, and agencies are getting much more, they're much better at kind of liaising with us and talking about what needs to happen. And there's that confidence is growing. So we're referring more out. But it's fascinating to watch how that mindset is changing.
I love this example. Thanks, Priya. One of the experts in my study really cautioned against kind of Western educators in international school settings around the assumptions that they can make about the services within and the kind of networks and support systems within the countries that their international schools are. And I think this is a really great example because maybe somebody who lived in the country that you're in for 20 years might not realize the changes that have been made and might be still basing decisions based on how things were rather than how things are. But I think what you've talked about is that real kind of fear that people have that, we always want to do no harm. We don't want to make things worse and make the child or the family more vulnerable. And there's nothing worse than having to make those decisions in the moment where you have a child and a family that is vulnerable. So the kind of antidote to that is to be really proactive and reach out to those agencies and build those relationships with law enforcement, with child services. If you are in a really high risk context, maybe looking at embassies and NGOs to support you as well. So really building those networks proactively so that when something happens, you have those relationships already, and asking questions like, if this were to, if something like this was to happen, what would your expectations be of us? And we can do that around data. Like if I share a concern with you on a no names basis, will you force me to give the name, or can you just advise me based on a hypothetical? So actually talking about where the boundaries are around that data sharing beforehand is really important as well.
And that helps build trust then between the parties so then they can support each other when they need to. Right?
Absolutely. And I think when there is that trust, then the relationship between the school and the agency shifts into more like, hey, this has happened. We're thinking about doing this. What do you think? So then the school can maybe drive a little bit more rather than being very passive in that relationship as well.
I've been really heartened to hear that a lot of schools do have proactive relationships with law enforcement and social service agencies in their country, and even sometimes have liaisons assigned to their school. So I do feel like that's such an important message that we create those relationships. And it's always nice when you feel like a message you've been like, that we've all been pushing for a while is actually hitting and people are doing it.
If you're a school leader, your day probably starts with questions. Who needs support? Where are the risks? What needs my attention right now? IntelliSchool helps answer those questions in real time by bringing attendance, well-being, behaviour and learning into one connected platform. IntelliSchool cuts through the noise and gives leadership teams the clarity they need. Fewer spreadsheets, smarter decisions, and more time to focus on what really matters, your students. Lead with confidence using IntelliSchool.
And Layla, you alluded to the challenge of anonymity in terms of safeguarding data, and what would you do if you're working with an agency that wanted there to be identification and you didn't feel that that was necessarily in the child's interest? I wonder, Debbie, if you can speak just a little bit more to how we can work with anonymous reporting data effectively in a safeguarding context.
Yeah, thank you. So something I've been thinking about throughout the conversation right now is I'll be at a conference and a school head will find me and just say, Debbie, am I doing it wrong? Like, I am finding so many concerns at my school. I feel like all of a sudden all we do is safeguarding, and I'm finding, concerns about adult behavior within our community or concerns that children are bringing to us. And it just feels like it's a lot. And I'm so supportive of people who say that, because when we're doing the work, then we see just how much it's happening around us. And anonymous reporting can help us to get to that point as well. Like, ideally, what we want to create is a culture within our schools where people are reporting, where they feel safe self-disclosing if they've had a situation that they need to share, or where they feel safe reporting about anything that concerns them, and they don't worry that they'll get in trouble as long as the report's made with good intention, and they don't worry that someone's going to get in trouble, like whoever they're reporting about, they won't get in trouble if nothing's happening either. Like, you want to create the ethos at your school where people aren't asking, what if I say something and I'm wrong? But they're asking, what if I don't say something and I'm right? And so trying to get to that place, and anonymous reports can help with that, because we know there's, especially with kids, but also with adults, there's all kinds of reasons that people don't report concerns. They might feel scared, ashamed. They might think that whatever's happening to them is their fault. They might feel not empowered to make a report. And so anonymous reporting channels can be a really helpful way to help to get those, help people to feel like they can share if they do have a concern. Especially with identity-based harm, it can be quite helpful for kids, again, to have an avenue to tell us what's going on without being the snitch.
One of the nuances or the tricky pieces of this that I've seen in a few schools is that, as we encourage people to self-report and to report what they see, you almost always see a rise in incidents. And trying to get a handle on, are things getting worse? Are people just reporting more? Oh my gosh, things have gone up 200% in the last year or two. And then there can be pushback against that, saying, well, we need to get the number lower. We need to show that we're doing something about this, which can then encourage people to not report as much. How do you navigate some of that terrain to get a handle on what's actually happening versus what is it that people are reporting is happening?
I was just going to say, I hope that's what we're part of what we're doing right now with this conversation, is helping people to know that you are doing a good job. If you're doing things that help people to report, you're doing what you're supposed to be doing.
I think the highest area where you might get some anxiety around numbers increasing is going to be the board of the school. So when you engage in this safeguarding work, it is really important to make the board aware of what the likely impact of the work is going to be, which is that there is going to be an increase in the number of concerns that are coming through to the school. And that can really be built in with the overall board training, which we advise. So as board members come in, they should have some safeguarding training, just like any volunteer who's spending a lot of time within the school community. But also there's board specific training, which can help them with understanding what their role is. And a really important role of the board is that check and challenge on the school's safeguarding practices. And so what we would think about in terms of data would be that once a year at least, so as part of like an annual report, the school gathers together all its safeguarding data and then kind of presents it in an appropriate way to the board, where you're looking at things like the number of concerns in different categories, how those might have changed year on year once you've got the data to be able to do that, how much training has been done. So going back to the beginning of the session when we were saying about PD records as being part of that, like what safer recruitment checks are being done, how many background checks did we do this year, all of that kind of data can be pulled into a report. You might also have some anonymized short case studies to contextualize that data. So taking the quantitative to the qualitative as well, and providing that kind of information to the board, and then having some dialogue around it as well. So I'm a real advocate of like doing this in more of a presentation mode, maybe making a video that the board can watch ahead of time, really kind of explaining what they're seeing, and then going into the board and having a Q&A with them. So just to have that dialogue. Another thing you can do is to actually do training on what the board should ask you. So what's an example of a check question? What's an example of a challenge question? What's an example of a supportive question? So like a supportive question would be like, so do you as the safeguarding lead feel like you've got capacity to deal with these, the number of cases? Whereas a challenge would be, you've got all of this training that you've done. How do you know that it's effective? And just shepherding the board through is really how you mitigate against that kind of data anxiety that you can get when boards start paying attention to safeguarding and child protection.
And what about those boards who do love a good dashboard, right? And they also love a good KPI, and they recognize that safeguarding is becoming of greater and greater importance, and that's a good thing. So they then want to marry all that together to work out what targets can we set on our dashboard to give a KPI that shows that safeguarding is getting more effective in our schools. Because I see that question playing out, I hear that question being asked, and I wonder what would be your responses to that.
If I can take that first, I would say one is that kind of education about what is a success metric for our work. So earlier I said about the number of self-reports. So if we're tallying the number of self-reports in an anonymized way, an indicator of success, an indicator of trust, an indicator that people understand the code of conduct, that is going to be an increase in the number of self-reports. So I think working together to work out what are good measures of success in terms of safeguarding and child protection. And it's not really going to be a decrease in the number of concerns that you get, although it might be in some areas. Like maybe we would see like you'd work on raising awareness and having reporting, and then you'd have an increase. Then you might do a lot of prevention work, and then maybe you might see a decrease. But you have to be realistic about the timeframes in that. We don't change culture quickly. But maybe around something like identity-based harm, you could look at kind of gathering that data, doing the work, and then looking at what the impact on the data is. As well. I think one thing that I would like to add before I pass it on is just around like the level of data sharing with the board. It really has to be dependent on the size of the school and what's suitable to share. If you're a really small school, you don't want to be sharing at like the grade level, because then you've got board members thinking about like, oh, someone in grade 7, that happened to someone in grade 7. So you might want to look at whole school data. Whereas if you have a really big school with large cohorts, maybe you do want to share on like at the level of a grade, or maybe you want to do primary school versus secondary school or something like that. But making sure that it is anonymized. The board shouldn't be having that personal information about students.
Before we bring this to the final question, do either of you have anything to add to that, Priya or Debbie?
No, I think Layla's really covered it really well in terms of the governance piece. I think one of the things that DSLs will often say, however, is in a governance meeting, often safeguarding is put at the end of a meeting, and it's given very little time if it's not bumped off completely because we've got the slide already. And that's because, when you were talking about KPIs, Matthew, and about what are the grades we want to achieve at the end of this year, especially international markets, it's a business. We need to attract students. So, we need to be showing that we are getting the best results for academic results for our students. So, maybe reminding governors that safeguarding should be at the top. Do that bit first before we go into all the other KPIs would be the only thing that I would add at that point.
I think it's important to talk to the board that this, it's not data that fits easily into KPIs, that it's going to be more qualitative than quantitative, right? That it is, something we talk a lot to schools about is making sure when you handle a case, make sure you don't forget the final part, which is to reflect on how you handled the case and to do a check-in, to do some check-ins down the road. And I think if you can come back to the board with, of course, generalized, anonymized information, but showing this is the difference we've made in some lives here, because we do. People who are doing this work in schools are making differences every day. And so I think it wouldn't be hard to gather some of that more qualitative data and say, here's how we reacted to a case, and here's the difference that we made in a very, again, anonymized way.
We're coming to the end of our time here. So final question, and if each of you could maybe take it in turn, love to hear from all of you on this one. If a school did want to strengthen its safeguarding data, just starting tomorrow, but has limited resources to do that, what is one thing that you would recommend that they start with?
I would just say making sure that you are recording all concerns with with whatever resources you have, whether you're using a paid system to record your concerns or whether you are, still doing it with a system you've created on your own, that you're not letting little things slide by, that the concerns are being documented and that your responses to every single concern is being documented so that you can see the differences over time that you're making. And again, so that you can look back at those concerns that have been registered and see when there's patterns that aren't being addressed and you need to escalate that concern.
Doing this podcast has really made me think about the breadth of data that feeds into safeguarding and maybe doing a kind of audit, I guess, of all the different pieces of data within your school that impact safeguarding. This is probably something that I'll do now, which I feel like I want to write down all the different things that we've said and just think about who's responsible, what system are we using, how are we thinking about retention and transfer and all of those things in relation to all of these different data sets, and then how are we pulling them together to have oversight of all of these pieces of data so we're using them effectively.
I kind of want to jump on exactly what Layla said as well. I've written loads of things down in terms of thinking of data and what data actually means. And, coming back to what you were saying, Debbie, that training element of helping people to understand what is it that they need to report, and also promoting a safeguarding culture within the school that's psychologically safe. So it doesn't matter whether or not your concern is safeguarding. If you're concerned about a child, you're concerned about a child. And, the underlying concern may be that they need intervention from something in another way, not because it's safeguarding, but helping people to feel that if they're worried about a child, then child at the centre of everything we do, report it in.
On behalf of Paul and me, just wanted to thank the three of you immensely. There's so much expertise in this room, and yet you've been able to talk to that expertise in a way that would make sense to anybody, whatever level or stage of their safeguarding journey they are on. So thank you so much for giving up your time to talk about this critical topic with us all, and we really, really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting us. It's been wonderful talking with everybody in here. And just like Priya and Layla, I'm certainly taking some notes.
Tune in next time as we continue our data conversations with educators and thought leaders from around the world.